stability. So when we refer to the term joint stability, we're referring to how well a joint can stay within its normal position where the two surfaces are articulating or completely congruent with each other. So when that joint becomes, those surfaces are not congruent and we have subluxations or dislocations, that means the joint is unstable. And so what contributes to joint stability? So a lot of things contribute to joint stability. So we're talking about static and dynamic stabilizers. So there are certain structures that assist with stabilizing the joint when it's moving and when it's not moving. There's also the history of injury that can impair structures that provide that stability. And then there's also a sensory motor system, which is how the brain and the joint communicate and provide stability. And injury can also impact that system as well. So I'm just going to briefly touch on all of these kind of factors. Joint stability gets really, really complicated. So if you go into DPT and MAT, you may look back on this lecture and think this was the most watered down version that I could possibly give, and it is. So we're just going to touch on all of these all these little factors so you understand, have a foundation to kind of jump off of, because when we go joint by joint and we talk about specific injuries, we're going to refer to what structures were responsible for stabilizing against that, and it varies joint by joint, force by different direction and magnitudes of force and different functions. So let's talk about first dynamic versus static stabilizers. So when we talk about dynamic, that's when the stabilizers, when the body is moving. So no matter what joint we're talking about, that's going to be muscles and tendons, because it's always going to, that creates the movement for us. When we talk about static stabilizers, that's always going to be bone, because the bone and the way the joint is created is going to provide that stability when the joint is not moving. Also, fibrocartilage can be an extension of the bone and deepen the socket and provide that additional static stability. So for example, when we're talking about the knee, I love this image here and how there's a little bit of space here to show you that the meniscus, which is a fibrocartilage disc, deepens the socket there, and it shows that the femoral condyle actually goes into that socket. It forms like a suction cup and provides that stability. So for the knee specifically, the fibrocartilage of the meniscus are static stabilizers and provide that additional support. It can also function as a dynamic stabilizer as well, but that gets a little complicated. When we talk about structures that can function as static and dynamic stabilizers, that's going to be ligaments and capsule. Sometimes they're static stabilizers and sometimes they're dynamic, and sometimes they can be both. And it really depends on the joint and what force we're talking about, and also just like what type of injury it's resisting against. So, and what kind of movement it is. So that will be joint by joint, and we will talk about that as we move on into those later modules in this class. But we will be, I will be identifying when certain structures will be dynamic and static. So just understand that dynamic is when we're stabilizing, when we're moving, and dynamic is when we're moving, and static is when we're staying still. So moving on, when we talk about the sensory motor system, the sensory motor system is how the brain and the joint are communicating and keeping it also stable and safe. So there are lots of receptors in the body, and we're going to talk about these mechanoreceptors that sense movement. And so we have Golgi tendon organs in the tendons. We have non-Golgi tendon in the ligaments. We have muscle spindles in the muscle, and we have Ruffini endings and Pacinian corpuscles in the capsule and the skin. So all of these receptors are basically sensing when there's movement. So this can be a stretch. This can be when we have swelling and it's swelling and stretching, or it can just be like a movement. So for example, a way to work on increasing your sensitivity of your sensory motor system is balancing. So let's say we're standing on like a Bosu ball, which is like a half a physio ball, very unstable, and we're wobbling around. All of these mechanoreceptors in our joint, for example, in our knee joint, so they're sensing when I'm moving back, when I'm moving forward, and when my knee is moving side to side. And they're basically sending a signal back to the brain saying, I'm moving this way. And the brain is sending a motor signal back to the knee of saying, when tighten here and contract here. And so it's all working together to be able to resist injury. It gets way more complicated than that. The sensory motor system is wildly complicated. So this is the easiest simplified way that I can describe it, of just understanding that there are mechanoreceptors in these specific structures. And it's important to know where they are located, because we will start identifying them and their role and their importance in a joint stability as we go joint by joint later on. So we can make those better by working on balance and proprioceptive activities, but they can also be injured after injury. So one thing like in research is really showing that the mechanoreceptors and a lot of the muscle spindles and the communication back to the brain from the quad and the knee joint itself is really affected after ACL. And we've also been able to determine by the dean of our college, who did a landmark study a long time ago, Dean Ingersoll, was able to identify that we can kind of quiet down the joint with ice and then get the signals really to get it kind of quiet where the pain signals aren't coming in. And then that makes these receptors more responsive. And then we're able to get a quad contraction better, and we're able to get just better activity and better stability back to the knee. So we will talk more about this as we get joint specific, but I just want you to understand from this section that joint stability is more complicated than just where the ligament's at and how is the knee positioned. We have our dynamic stabilizers and our static stabilizers working together, but also with our sensory motor system and the brain, and all of those things are important to intervene on after injury. So we will discuss this further as we get down joint by joint, but if you have any questions right now, just kind of the fundamental concepts and understand the definitions of these structures, then reach out.